On Christmas, my brother, the one who always borrowed money and never paid back, raised his glass and said, "You'll cover dinner, right?" I said no. The next morning, he showed up with the bill anyway. But when he read the receipt, his hands started shaking. And the real twist was still waiting for him. I, 34M, finally had enough of my brother's games at Christmas dinner. The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting made everything look warm and golden, but nothing about that night felt warm to me. I sat at the head of the long table, watching my brother work the room like he always did, laughing too loud, touching everyone's shoulder, playing the role of the beloved family man. My parents beamed at him from across the table. My sister smiled whenever he cracked a joke, and I sat there, jaw tight, remembering every single dollar he'd taken from me over the years. $18,000. That's what I'd calculated the week before. $18,000 borrowed over 7 years, each time with a promise to pay me back, each time with a story about why things were tight. The car repair that turned out to be a vacation. The medical emergency that became a down payment on a boat. The business investment that never existed. And every single time, I'd believed him because that's what family does, right? He raised his glass near the end of dinner, that charming smile plastered across his face, and asked if I'd cover the bill. Not asked really. Assumed. The whole table turned to look at me, expectant, like this was just how things worked. Like I was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who always picked up the pieces. I looked at him for a long moment, and I said no. The table went quiet. My mother's smile faltered. My father frowned. My brother laughed it off, said he was just joking, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the slight panic. He flagged down the waiter and made a show of pulling out his credit card, playing the magnanimous host, though I knew he was probably scrambling inside. I paid for my own meal. I wished everyone a Merry Christmas. And I left. The next morning, my doorbell rang at 8 o'clock. I opened the door to find my brother standing there, looking haggard, with a piece of paper clutched in his hand. He asked if we could talk. His voice had that edge to it, that mixture of desperation and anger he got when things weren't going his way. I let him in. He followed me to the kitchen where I poured myself coffee and didn't offer him any. He put the paper down on the counter, and I could see it was the restaurant receipt from the night before. He asked me if I knew anything about this, his finger stabbing at the bottom of the page. I picked it up and looked. The total was significantly higher than it should have been for our party. An extra $2,000, to be exact. I looked at him and asked what he was talking about. His hands were shaking slightly as he explained. He'd paid for dinner last night on his credit card, gone home feeling humiliated but trying to maintain his dignity. And then this morning he'd checked his credit card statement. There was the restaurant charge, just as expected, but when he looked at the itemized receipt they'd emailed him, there was an additional charge he hadn't authorized. A private room fee. Except we hadn't used a private room. We'd sat in the main dining area. He demanded to know if I'd had something to do with it. His voice was rising. He accused me of tampering with his bill, of paying off the restaurant to overcharge him, of sabotaging him. I told him calmly that I had no idea what he was talking about. I suggested he call the restaurant and sort it out with them. It was probably just a billing error. But he didn't move. He stood there staring at me, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He said it was convenient, wasn't it, that the one time he actually paid for something, this happened. He said I'd orchestrated this whole thing to humiliate him. I took a sip of my coffee and asked him if he'd lost his mind. I reminded him that he'd been the one who'd asked me to pay, that I'd simply declined, and that what happened with his credit card afterward had nothing to do with me. He called the restaurant right there in my kitchen, his voice sharp and demanding. I listened as he explained the situation to whoever answered the phone. There was a long pause while they looked something up. Then his face went pale. The person on the other end was apparently explaining something to him. I watched as he listened, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something approaching horror. He thanked them curtly and hung up. He turned to me and said there had been a private room booked in his name. For that exact night. For a party of 12. He said he never booked it, that someone must have called pretending to be him. I asked him why anyone would do that. He stared at me, and I could see the accusation forming in his eyes again. But before he could speak, his phone rang. It was our sister. I could hear her voice through the speaker, urgent and upset. She asked him if he'd gotten a weird email. He put her on speaker and asked what she was talking about. She said she'd received an email this morning from what looked like an attorney's office. It was a formal demand letter requesting repayment of a loan. Her loan. The $4,000 he'd borrowed from her 3 years ago to help with his supposed legal fees. The email stated that if she didn't make arrangements for repayment within 30 days, they'd begin legal proceedings. My brother's face went white. He said he didn't send any email, that he didn't hire any attorney. Our sister asked him what the hell was going on, why he was suddenly demanding money back that he'd borrowed from her. He tried to explain that it wasn't him, that someone was impersonating him, but she cut him off. She said she'd also received a similar email about money he'd borrowed from their cousin, and another one about the $1,500 he'd taken from our aunt. He hung up on her and stood there, breathing hard. He looked at me and said I'd done this. All of it. The restaurant charge. The emails. Everything. I asked him again how I could possibly have orchestrated any of that. I pointed out that I didn't even have access to his email account or his credit cards. I suggested that maybe, just maybe, someone else was as tired of his behavior as I was. His phone rang again. Our father. Then our mother. Then his friend from college. Each call brought the same story. Demand letters. Formal requests for repayment. Some from an attorney's office, others from a debt collection agency. Every single person he'd borrowed money from over the past decade was suddenly receiving professional, legal-looking correspondence demanding repayment. And that's when he saw it. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped his phone, but he managed to open his email. There was a message waiting for him from a law firm I'd never heard of. The subject line read, regarding outstanding debts and possible criminal charges. He opened it right there in front of me. I watched his face as he read. The email laid out, in clinical detail, every loan he'd taken from family members over the past 10 years. The amounts, the dates, the stated reasons for borrowing. And beneath each entry, there was a notation about what the money had actually been used for, complete with receipts, bank statements, and photographs. The car repair that had been a trip to Vegas. The medical emergency that had been a down payment on a boat he'd later sold. The business investment that had been gambling debts. Everything. Every lie cataloged and documented with precision. The email stated that while these transactions had been framed as loans between family members, the pattern of behavior and the documented deception constituted potential fraud. It noted that while the law firm had been retained to pursue civil remedies, they were also obligated to report potential criminal behavior to the appropriate authorities if their client wished to pursue that avenue. At the bottom of the email was a proposed settlement. He would have 90 days to create a repayment plan for every dollar he'd borrowed. If he agreed and stuck to the plan, no further action would be taken. If he refused, the matter would be turned over to law enforcement, and civil suits would be filed by each individual creditor. The email was signed by a senior partner at what appeared to be a legitimate law firm. My brother looked at me, his face ashen. He asked me how much this had cost me. He asked how long I'd been planning this. He asked if I understood what I'd done to him, to his reputation, to his relationships with everyone in the family. I told him I hadn't done anything. I suggested that perhaps one of the other people he'd borrowed from had finally reached their limit. I mentioned that $18,000 was enough to make someone consider legal options. But he knew. Even as I denied it, even as I maintained my innocent expression, he knew. Because he'd been gaming the system for years, and he recognized when someone had finally beaten him at his own game. The truth was simple, though I never confirmed it to him. I had spent 3 months meticulously documenting every loan he'd taken from every family member. I'd reached out to each person privately, explained what I was doing, and asked for their records. Most had been relieved that someone was finally addressing it. Some had been angry that I was stirring up family drama, but enough had cooperated to give me what I needed. I'd hired a legitimate law firm, the same one I'd used for my business contracts. I'd explained the situation, asked if there was any legal recourse, and discovered that yes, while family loans were complicated, a pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation could indeed be pursued. They'd drafted the demand letters. They'd outlined the potential criminal implications. And they'd sent everything simultaneously to create maximum impact. The restaurant charge had been my one moment of creative liberty. I'd called ahead the week before, explained that I wanted to book a private room for a party, and provided my brother's credit card number that I'd memorized from the one time he'd left his wallet at my house. I'd authorized a $2,000 deposit for the room, knowing he'd used that same card to pay for dinner. The restaurant had simply charged it to his account as authorized. Technically not legal, technically fraud on my part, but I'd made sure to do it in a way that couldn't be easily traced back to me. And I'd known he wouldn't make too much noise about it once everything else started falling apart around him. He left my house that morning without another word. Over the next few days, I heard from various family members. Some were angry at me, convinced I'd orchestrated the whole thing. Some were angry at him, finally seeing clearly what he'd been doing for years. Some were just confused and hurt. My brother tried to deny everything at first. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd always intended to pay everyone back, that the law firm was making false accusations. But when confronted with the receipts and bank statements, with photographic evidence of his boat and his vacation and his expensive purchases, he couldn't maintain the lie. He did agree to the repayment plan eventually. He had no choice. The alternative was potential criminal charges and civil suits he couldn't afford to fight. Our parents insisted he get a second job. His wife, who'd apparently been kept in the dark about much of this, demanded full financial transparency going forward. Every member of the family who'd been listed as a creditor received a formal apology and the first payment within 30 days. As for me, I maintained my innocence. I expressed shock at the whole situation. I told anyone who asked that I had no idea who'd hired the law firm, though I thought it was probably for the best. I attended the awkward family dinners where my brother sat quietly, stripped of his charm and his easy manipulations. The real twist came 3 months later. My brother had been making his payments on time, working 2 jobs, stripped of his pride, but apparently determined to make things right. He'd stopped speaking to me almost entirely, and at family gatherings we existed in a cold politeness that suited me fine. Then he showed up at my house again, this time at 6 in the evening. I opened the door to find him standing there with an envelope in his hand. He asked to come in. I hesitated but stepped aside. He sat down at my kitchen table, that same table where he'd confronted me about the restaurant bill, and he put the envelope down between us. He told me he knew it was me. He knew I'd orchestrated the whole thing, hired the lawyers, made the restaurant booking, coordinated everything. He said he'd spent weeks trying to figure out how to prove it, trying to find evidence he could use against me. Then he said he'd realized something. He said that for the first time in his adult life, he'd actually had to face consequences for his actions. He'd had to look at himself honestly and admit what he'd become. He'd had to have difficult conversations with his wife, with his kids, with himself. And somewhere in the process of working 2 jobs and making payments and being forced to budget, he'd started to understand what he'd done to all of us. He told me the envelope contained a check for $18,000. Every penny I'd loaned him over the years, plus interest calculated at 5%. He said it was the first payment that wasn't court-ordered or legally mandated. It was the first one that came from genuine remorse. He asked if I'd accept it, not as a way to clear his conscience, but as proof that he was actually changing. I looked at the envelope for a long moment. I thought about all the years of lending and never being repaid, all the excuses and promises, all the times I'd felt like the family fool for continuing to believe him. And I thought about the 3 months I'd spent planning my revenge, the satisfaction I'd felt watching it all unfold, the cold justice of finally holding him accountable. I pushed the envelope back across the table and told him to put it toward his other debts. I told him I'd already written off my money years ago, that I'd considered it the cost of learning who he really was. I said if he wanted to prove he'd changed, he could do it by finishing his repayment plan and being honest with his kids about what he'd done and why. He sat there for a moment, looking at the envelope, then at me. Then he picked it up and nodded. He thanked me quietly and left. I never confirmed to him that I'd been behind it all, but we both knew. And in the end, that understanding between us, that acknowledgement of what I'd done and why I'd done it, was worth more than any confession. The family eventually settled into a new normal. Some members never forgave him fully. Others appreciated his efforts to make amends. My parents struggled with the reality of what their golden child had been doing for years. And I remained the stable one, the responsible one, though now I was also the one everyone was slightly wary of. They'd seen what I was capable of when pushed too far. Christmas dinner this year was at my parents' house again. My brother showed up with his family, made no grand gestures, and sat quietly through the meal. When the check came, my father reached for it. But my brother stopped him, said he had it, and paid without comment or expectation of praise. As we were leaving, he caught my eye across the parking lot. He didn't smile or wave. He just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that said more than words could. I nodded back. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about forcing someone to finally see themselves clearly. And sometimes, if you're very calculated and very patient, you can architect a situation where the person who wronged you has no choice but to grow into someone better. Whether my brother's change proves permanent remains to be seen. But at least now, every member of my family knows exactly what the cost of his charm has been. And I know that I'm capable of protecting myself and the people I care about, even if it means becoming someone a little colder, a little more calculating than I used to be. The $18,000 is still gone, but I got something better back, the certainty that I'll never be anyone's fool again.